Today we'll largely be looking at two major movements, conceptual art and earthworks, also referred to as land art. These movements first emerged in the late 60s and early 70s and lasted well into the 90s, and in some cases to the present day. They both represent a dematerialization of art, physically and symbolically. Here are some important terms and artists to look out for in this lecture. The movements that we'll be looking at today are reflective of the art world at this time. The experimental exploration of art that we looked at during the last lecture paved the way for the new and unique art of these movements. Artists, already having explored new media, made an almost complete shift away from traditional painting and sculpture, instead opting to explore a variety of non-traditional media and found objects, often resulting in work that was ephemeral. Whether it was a performance, a short-term installation, or made from organic materials that would begin to break down quickly. Part of the rationale for creating this kind of art was an act of rebellion against the commodification or commercialization of art. With the increasing value of art in America, artists didn't want the primary focus of their work to be on its economic value. Conceptual art, a long-lasting movement that was inspired by the Fluxus performance artists and the minimalist movement, placed emphasis upon the concept or idea and de-emphasized the actual physical manifestation of the work. Thus, an artist did not need manual skill to produce their work, and in some cases would not make anything at all. Refusing to work in any one medium, and especially hostile to the painting and sculptural traditions of Western art, conceptual artists broadened their approach to art making to include just about any material: text, photography, found objects, and even the physical space of the gallery, as long as there was a conceptual dimension. That conceptual element tended to emphasize a set of principles, or a philosophical idea, or a process involved in producing a given work, or sometimes all three. Perhaps one of the best works to explain conceptual art as a movement is this early creation by Joseph Kosuth entitled 1 and 3 Chairs. Conceptual artists like Kosuth were building off of ideas from the minimalists, rejecting the Western tradition of painting and focusing on a sort of purity of form. However, these artists did want to explore deeper meaning, philosophies, and ideas that could be communicated through that abstracted, simple form. They wanted to downplay the pleasures associated with looking at art as part of a rejection of what they saw as outdated ideas about beauty. In the case of 1 and 3 Chairs, the central idea was to explore the nature of representation itself. We know instinctively what a chair is, but how is it that we actually conceive of and communicate that concept? Kosuth presents us with a photograph of a chair, an actual chair, and its linguistic or language-based definition. All three of these could be interpreted as representations of the same chair, the one chair in the title, and yet they are not the same. They each have distinct properties. In actuality, the viewer is confronted with 3 chairs, each represented and experienced or read in different ways. Artists coming to fruition at this time were still being trained in the dominant style, so the abstract expressionist painters like Rothko and Pollock and Frankenthaler. But as conceptual art was gaining in popularity, this art too became seen as something antiquated and reminiscent of the stuffy, formal art world with all of its rules. Baldessari had been trained this way and hated what he made. This print, which started out as a scrawling in his notebook, represents his vow to create no more boring or serious art, to push the boundaries of abstraction and make art that required deep thought and explored challenging concepts. Bruce Nauman is another conceptual artist who uses performance, video, and other non-traditional media to explore the effects of physical, psychological, and intellectual experiences. Like Kosuth, Nauman explores the role of language and visual representation in meaning. He is challenging how and why we interpret meaning. What makes something a fountain? Does the word refer to a concrete fixture with plumbing, or can it be anything that shoots water? Nauman, likely in reference to Duchamp's infamous fountain, a flipped-over urinal that caused a huge stir among art critics, is pulling a similar stunt with his irreverent photograph. Nauman is best known for his flickering neon light assemblages. Some, like this one, remain static, while others blink on and off in certain order and arrangements to create quasi-animation sequences. In The True Artist Helps the World by Revealing Mystic Truths, for one, Nauman has taken a cheap industrial material, usually associated with tawdry business and sleazy motels, and put it in a high art context. On a more conceptual note, remember back from a few lectures ago when we were talking about the abstract expressionists, the New York school of painters that, instead of appealing to emotions, wanted to appeal to universal truths, thoughts of the unconscious mind, archetypes or patterns that we see throughout history shared by a human collective unconscious? Nauman is still calling on artists to do this by cleverly placing his message within a spiral, a mysterious symbol that appears consistently throughout nature and mathematics as part of a natural phenomenon. In this blinking assemblage, he also uses neon lights, and their overlapping and sketchy figures are unlike most things that would be seen in this medium. The jerky interaction of the two figures in Mean Clown Welcome suggests the conflicting forces of attraction and repulsion in human relationships, as the figures both welcome and battle one another. We also see the shockingly neon male genitalia that jars the viewer and adds a level of silliness that is common in conceptual art. It is often a part of Nauman's work as he draws on intimacy, attraction, and again, repulsion in human relationships. Another important conceptual artist who works with light is Namjoon Pak. Born in Korea and a later naturalized U.S. citizen, Pak had a unique relationship with and interest in American pop culture that is evident in his work, always revolving around technology, information, and media. TV Garden illustrates Pak's profound grasp of technology's capacity for composition and the new aesthetic discourse that he helped to create. Entering this piece, the viewer experiences an uncanny fusion of the natural and the scientific. Hidden amid an undergrowth of live plants are video monitors of various sizes. The concept in this particular work is the stark juxtaposition of technology and nature. In this later piece from 1995, we can see how Pak's style and the complexity of his work has evolved with the evolution of technology. This map of sorts uses neon lights to show the borders of the continental United States, with 313 televisions playing commercials or recognizable images from pop culture. In this piece, the concept that Pak wants the viewer to explore is identity as it is linked to place, specifically states and regions in the United States, as well as how that identity is amplified or pictured by media and television. You might note that each cluster of TVs plays videos related to the area, like Martin Luther King Jr. giving a speech in the Alabama state and scenes from The Wizard of Oz in Kansas. Artist Jenny Holzer, more of a neo-conceptualist since most of her work was produced in the 90s or later, uses light to create massive projections on city buildings and scrolling LED light installations that recall movie marquees. She writes phrases or takes quotes and illuminates them devoid of context in bright colors. The phrases are often ominous or have a sense of unease. They tend to be short but profound questions or statements that make us examine topics surrounding relationships and identity that we may not be comfortable thinking about. Another conceptual artist who has skyrocketed to fame in recent years but has been creating installations since the 1960s is Yayoi Kusama. In Narcissus Garden, named for the famed Greek mythological figure who fell in love with his own reflection, Kusama's highly reflective mirror spheres tempt the viewer to examine their own image in the curved surface, ignoring the beautiful natural setting and instead fixating on their own reflection. Kusama is more well known for her whole room pieces. You may recognize some of her mirror room installations, popular tourist destinations for mind-bending selfies, an ironic trend considering Kusama's themes of narcissism. The first of these installations that helped bring her name to the forefront of the art world is her 1965 mirror installation called Phallis Field, filled with vaguely phallus-shaped stuffed objects covered with red and white polka dots. The reflective walls on all sides serve not only to reflect the objects into infinity, an endless sea of red and white, but also to directly involve the viewer, place them in the middle of the scene as part of the artwork. Themes of repetition, infinite, fantastical, and illusory space, and of course polka dots, are common in all of her work. Another major artistic movement that roughly coincides with conceptual art and is very similar in theme is earthworks, or land art. During this movement, artists worked with the natural world and the forces in it, with the outdoors as their gallery. Like conceptual artists, they did not want to make art that could be commodified, so the work that they made was often very fleeting and difficult to access. The emergence of this movement coincided with a major move towards environmental activism in the late 60s and 70s, as people began to become more aware of and angry about the devastating effects of industrialism on the natural world. Like conceptual art and its predecessors of minimalism and fluxus art, we also see an emphasis on process and materials, like in Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. Created in 1972 on the northwestern shore of the Great Salt Lake in Utah, Smithson was inspired by the barren landscape and the odd pinkish hue of the water caused by the high salt content. He wanted to make a piece of art that reflected the natural landscape, but would also change and shift with the fluctuating water levels over time. Smithson envisioned an artwork in a state of constant transformation, whose form is never fixed and undergoes decay from the moment of its creation, something that cannot be commodified, and is in many ways an extension of the natural landscape. You can still visit Spiral Jetty today and walk to the center of it, though it is no longer underwater due to the lower levels of the lake. Christo and Jean-Claude are a married couple who created enormous fabric earthworks as a team for decades. Their installations were temporary and usually involved taking massive, carefully constructed swaths of fabric and incorporating them in interesting ways into the landscape. In these short-lived pieces, they aimed to make such drastic alterations to recognizable landscapes and buildings as to force the viewer to look at them in a new way, and in the case of landscapes, to consider them through the lens of the art world. In Surrounded Islands, the artists painstakingly planned out the work with sketches and measurements to create pieces of bright pink fabric that wrapped perfectly around two small islands off the coast of Miami. The monumental work of Christo and Jean-Claude is meant to highlight the beauty of natural landscapes, but is also conceptual. Much of their work references capitalism and its packaging and commodifying of nature. The work is very labor-intensive, requiring sometimes hundreds of workers to create and assemble the massive swaths of fabric. In addition, the work is inherently political. The process of planning and overcoming government regulations is a part of every single piece, taking years to complete compared to the final project, which stays in place for a very short time. The gates in Central Park took 26 years to realize, fighting through city bureaucracy, and only lasted for 16 days. Other earthworks artists like to use not only the earth itself, but its natural forces and processes. Walter de Maria's lightning field is an excellent example, an assemblage of 400 stainless steel poles in an isolated field in New Mexico. De Maria's composition comes alive during storms when the lightning is drawn to the metal rods, creating fantastical and otherworldly performances of light dancing across the sky. De Maria has received many accolades for his creative and innovative approach to earthworks, harnessing a powerful natural force to demonstrate both its incredible beauty and danger, creating a sort of performance for the viewer. Earthworks or land art became popular all around the world, and the style is still used by some contemporary artists today. Milton Becerra was interested in alluding to natural forces as well, and is credited with bringing land art to Venezuela. Deeply concerned with the environment and the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, there is a deep spirituality and reverence to nature in Becerra's work. Like De Maria, his work suggests both the beauty and the destructive power of nature. His work also utilizes indigenous motifs and themes, particularly focused on groups in the Amazon. Becerra later ventured even further into eco-art, an extension of land art that uses only environmentally friendly methods and materials and specifically focuses on environmental issues. Both land art and its offshoot of eco-art remain popular today, especially as artists and people in general are more aware of the destruction of the environment and the loss of unique ecosystems around the world at an alarming rate. These artists, often working in more sustainable media than their predecessors, also aim to showcase the breathtaking beauty of nature that can often be forgotten. Like the earthworks artists of the 70s, this work aims to place nature in the framework of the art world, while avoiding the commodification inherent in that environment. Let's review a few main points from today's lecture. First, as is implied with the title of this presentation, we see an almost complete shift away from painting and sculpture. Artists are interested in exploring as many new materials as they can, sometimes technological or industrial materials like neon lights or TV screens, but others used more fleeting and natural materials, things that would break down over time. This was partially to avoid commodification of art. Artists at this time criticized the art world not only for its continued adherence to rules and standards about what constituted good art, but also because of the growing commercialization of the art world. Artists did not want their work to be judged solely on economic value. Conceptual artists, inspired by Fluxus and minimalist artists, explored deep concepts and ideas in their work, often layered with meaning around identity, relationships, loss, and the human experience. For both conceptual artists and earthworks artists, building on the work of their predecessors, the process and materials of their work were extremely important, often informing the meaning of the finished piece.